Hey, first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for joining me for this Constitutional Challenges Roundtable. Okay, we're going to be discussing the many different ways in which we find that the Trump administration has violated or launched an attack on constitutional rights. Um, so thank you for joining us on this important discussion. Look, we're going to examine uh, the alleged violations organized by constitutional amendments. Okay, we're going to analyze some legal challenges, some judicial rulings, and the ongoing disputes. So briefly, if you'd each take a moment to introduce yourselves and what your background is. Thank you. Welcome to this roundtable. Today, we're going to be examining unconstitutional actions by the Trump administration. I'm your host, Mayhem, and on behalf of the Money Out of Politics movement, we'd like to welcome all of our viewers. Our discussion today is going to examine alleged violations organized by constitutional amendments. So we're going to go through them in order, and we're going to analyze legal challenges, judicial rulings, and the ongoing disputes caused by these constitutional challenges. So briefly, starting with civil litigation attorney, please introduce yourself and give us your background. Thank you.
Hi, uh, I'm a civil litigation attorney here in Georgia, and I've been practicing law for about 7.5 years now. And I have a strong background in constitutional law, so really passionate about this. I'm happy to be here to discuss these violations on our Constitution.
All right, and thank you for that. Thank you for being here. And Jesse?
Hey guys, thanks for having me back on the panel. Uh, my name is Jesse. I'm out of Connecticut. I'm kind of like an armchair historian, essentially. I view a lot of what's going on right now through a historical lens and perspective, and I'm excited to lend my opinion on some of these violations of constitutional law.
All right, thank you, Jesse, and thanks again for being here. We have, rather, in my opinion, a distinguished panel of folks here who will engage in an open discussion, and we're going to move through the constitutional framework shown in our slides, just to give you a visual representation. The white paper that this conversation is based on that has more detail on all the cases is available on our website as well as our Substack. You can follow my Substack at quietmayhem.substack.com. You can visit the Money Out of Politics movement at www.moneyoutofpolitics.org, or you can follow me on TikTok or YouTube at Quiet Mayhem and quiet.mayhem. Okay, hey, we're going to jump right in here and start off with one of the most important and perhaps why it was named the first amendment to the Constitution, and discuss some of the First Amendment violations that we've seen. So let's begin with the First Amendment challenges. They involve targeting of law firms and the anti-DEI executive orders. So civil litigation attorney, could you help us understand the constitutional implications of stripping security clearances from firms representing political opponents?
Sure. We all know the First Amendment to be the right to freedom of speech, the right to press, free assembly, the right to religious freedom. So this one is mostly going to go to freedom of speech. So what we're looking at are, executive orders issued by Donald Trump that essentially attack law firms who have represented anybody he doesn't like, really, political opponents, critics, etc. And so he issued these executive orders that purport, to be in purport to comport with the law, that is. And the reality is they just don't. So these things strip the security clearance from the law firms, and that's the difficulty with that is standing alone. Like, say this is just like maybe a regular attorney. It might not, violate freedom of speech to deny them a security clearance. And I think there's probably a really strong argument for deference to the executive. But what we're seeing with this is obviously it's meant to punish someone for essentially what would be speech. And when you're representing someone like Hillary Clinton, you know, someone with that sort of stature, having a security clearance is going to be integral to being able to adequately represent that person. And so, uh, I foresee, now, of course, I want to make clear none of these things have been litigated on merit. I foresee punishing someone for representing someone whose political speech you don't like is going to be problematic under the Constitution because without this security clearance, it's going to make it very difficult to, adequately inform yourself on the sensitive nature that may, be contained in the litigation, things like that. But and I don't know if you want to go ahead and talk about this part as well, but it's really the more problematic part of these executive orders are barring attorneys from federal buildings. So barring access to a government building like that based on your speech, your political speech, who you've represented is absolutely going to violate the Constitution. Number one, just because freedom of assembly, you can't bar somebody from a federal building because you don't like who they represented, right? Um, and and then also, like I said, with the speech of representing, it's still speech to associate with somebody. So a lot of times, I don't think people consider that freedom of association. So you can't force me to speak, and you can't prevent me from speaking in a way that's constitutionally protected. So because of the association with Hillary Clinton or whoever, they're being punished, and that's really the gist of what we're looking at here.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to actually chime in on that too as well, because you touched on a few things that was going through my mind as well. Because this bleeds into a multitude of different topics, right? When we talk about the First Amendment, considering just the First Amendment alone contains multiple provisions within it, right? I think from a historical perspective, it would make kind of sense because the First Amendment is the most heavily litigated provision in the Constitution, right? Like historically speaking, since it was written and then ratified till today, no other amendment in the Constitution has been so litigated over. Because again, and there's a few reasons for that, right? One of them is the amount of freedoms that would be contained in the First Amendment, but also like how they extend outward, right? Freedom of speech, and how that extends to universities per se, freedom of the press and the extent to that and what that looks like essentially. And obviously, this bleeds into other things like government censorship, how one expresses their religion or right or protest or whatnot. So there's a reason why these are so heavily litigated over. When it comes into the perspective of Trump, obviously, and the challenges that he has made, which I'm sure we'll go over more, it's clear that there is an intent here to attack these kinds of civil liberties while disguised masquerading in different forms of patriotism or what we would perceive as patriotism, right? So he might say that he's trying to, fix DEI practices and unfair treatments of, X kind of students or ideologies within universities and disguising it as that while we know in actuality these are civil liberties being attacked. And it's very evident by the response from these universities like Harvard that is mobilizing at a rate that I would argue is unprecedented. It's kind of amazing to see.
Yeah, I mean, it really doesn't. And like you said, with it purports to be one thing, like, oh, security clearances and they're a national security threat, but they're not, are they? Like, it's very clear that he's attacking them because of their representation of a certain person. So honestly, it gaslights the entire nation almost every day.
Agreed. Agreed. And, this slide also highlights the anti-DEI executive orders. What are the constitutional concerns with forcing ideological compliance, right? And I think this is an important question, and it touches on a lot of things. Freedom of speech touches on freedom of religion, and now we see, the federal government asking agencies to put out memos to report people suspected of anti-Christian bias. In terms of uh, constitutional concerns with forcing compliance with anti-DEI measures in comport with this, what are your thoughts surrounding that?
Yeah, I mean, where to start, right? just so I get the question correctly, you're talking about like universities and policing thought essentially, right? Or just in general?
Well, I think in general, right? So in terms of the anti-DEI orders, right, the slide kind of discusses here the executive orders of anti-DEI, right? And we've seen that bleed into the private sector under various different threats. In terms of the Constitution, what areas of the Constitution you find that to be problematic? In terms of free speech? Specifically, as we discuss and finish up on the First Amendment here.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets really tricky very, very quickly, right? Policing thought, policing practices in workplaces that would extend freedom of expression and speech within workplaces, universities, things like that, is a very, very tricky, slippery slope that we can fall into. And from what I see, I mean, it's not as if the United States has not done this before, right? Like we have a very long history of trying to find where that border is between what should be allowed and what isn't allowed, essentially, what is protected in the Constitution and what is not protected in the Constitution. And this line is shifted every so often, all the time, right? Through court cases, through policies, through different lawsuits and whatnot. I would argue when we look at the Trump administration to these things, it is across the board a unanimous affront on every single in every single instance. Whether we look at DEI, obviously, whether we look at universities, it is clear that he is trying to push a very unified agenda of culture, of breaking down, obviously, these DEI practices, um, while again keeping within his legal boundaries per se. I would still argue this is absolutely an infringement. Not to jump too far ahead, but I think this is actually covered under the Ninth Amendment, where the Ninth Amendment actually essentially says even those rights that are not enumerated in the Constitution or not specifically listed here are still protected. And I think in that lens, we can come back to the First Amendment. We kind of say the same thing when we look at DEI, when we look at different ideologies that the Trump administration would argue is being pushed by universities. This is still protected, even if it's not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. And I think this shows two things. One, it's the testament of the power of the First Amendment, first off, which is truly incredible. And two, it just kind of proves in juxtaposition to that where Trump sits and how he clearly is assaulting these things on multiple fronts.
Yeah, I mean, really, if you think about the spirit of the First Amendment and what it's supposed to do for our nation, it's just honestly the assault is just so flagrant, you know. It's just it's just absolutely on its face an assault on free speech and unconstitutional. The reason why we have the First Amendment, obviously, is part of it is to make sure that your government can't punish you for criticizing it, right? Which I think anybody who wants their nation to be better would understand the principle behind that. And it's also meant to spur speech and thought. And so the idea is, you have a broad protection, which the United States protects speech, really unlike pretty much any nation on earth. And uh, the free flow of idea is honestly, I think what makes us great. It helps spur, you know, ingenuity and progress. And so we're supposed to have this free flow of speech when, speech that's not accepted by society will be naturally cast aside by society. And societal consequences of speech will govern that, not the government. Um, and so you see that just with the DEI thing. That if he's allowed to control speech to that degree, it's going to naturally result in less diversity, right? Less equity, which is antithetical to progress. It's very un-American. It's an assault on equal protection, equal rights. Uh, and it really, this I think Justin touched on it. This one really you can talk about it probably in a variety of areas. I think the Judge Howell compared it to McCarthyism,
Yeah.
which yeah. So
Yeah.
and I think that's I don't know if anybody wants to touch on that too, but uh, it's also meant to oppress political opposition, right? So it's just in any which way you look at the history of the First Amendment, the spirit of the First Amendment, this one pretty much hits it at every level.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and it's so interesting that you bring that up because that is something. I mean, how does the judicial comparison to McCarthy era repression inform our understanding of what's happening now? I think is a great question, and look, one other question that I have. And I'll make this a compound question for you guys to answer before we move on to Fourth and Fifth Amendment as it relates to the administration, but. How does the judicial comparison to McCarthy inform our understanding of what's happening now? And also, what precedents might these challenges that we're seeing now establish? And so, with those two questions, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I mean, if I could jump in right away, there's obviously a lot of books on McCarthyism. Just a small one, if anyone's interested in a read. It's called On Fascism by Matthew McWilliams. It's like a 150-page read. It's not that long, and he touches on McCarthyism in a very good way, I think, in comparison to Trumpism. And what we can really say, honestly, historically speaking, is that Trumpism is McCarthyism on steroids, right? So like Joseph McCarthy having entered in to Congress in the late 40s and having only stayed there, I think, 8, 10 years. And in that short amount of time, he was able to flip the country rather on its head by creating this huge Red Scare. And really, his legacy is pointing the finger without any substantive like evidence to back up his claims and creating chaos and fear without having presented anything, right? I believe that throughout his time in Congress, he would consistently say, I have a list, and this list would continuously grow, right? I think it started with 50, and then it went to 100, and then 150, and then 200 known communist sympathizers were in the federal government, they were in the State Department, and it kept growing with no evidence. Um, and I do want to say there was one senator, I don't remember if she was from Maine or Alaska, but her response to him was absolutely amazing and resonates today. I might actually go grab that in a second, which I'll let civil litigator take over in a minute, because I would love to read parts of her reply. I think they resonate very, very good today. But I think that's the precedent that Joseph McCarthy had set was being able to criticize and even create congressional investigations and hearings because the scare was so potent and the public opinion, statistically speaking, grew up to almost, I think it was 65% of the public believed that there were known communist sympathizers within the federal government just off of accusations. And I think this is like insane. It's insane how one man creating a huge narrative and scare can cause such public distrust without any evidence. And I think this is exactly what Trumpism is, right? And this is a huge affront to the safety and security of our democracy and democratic norms.
Yeah, so one of the attorneys that was representing Perkins Coie actually they said um, it sounds more like national insecurity than national security. And I feel like that's pretty spot on because, what you saw in McCarthyism was literally like, oh, this communism is so scary. What will we do? And that allowed them to criminalize speech, essentially. There were many people that went to jail under the Alien Registration Act back then for simply, speculating on, reading, learning about, or promoting anything that had to do with communist theories. And it also it makes I think it makes government officials scared to do their job freely. So, like you hear today when we talk about universal health care, universalist, oh, you're socialist, you're communist, this and that. But you could see it curbing any sort of progressive proposals like that. You could certainly see lawyers and law firms scared to do their jobs, wondering if they represent somebody in particular. Will they be the next target of of an executive order like this? And of an overall, a broader perspective, they're literally commanding policy, legislation, and just the thought processes, the ideologies that are taught or promoted or what have you, like in the university system. People, number one, are not going to get as broad of education as they would have. And then you're just going to see people scared to speak thoughts out loud. And that's exactly what the First Amendment was supposed to prevent, you know? So I'm glad to see the judiciary doing their job and holding the line for a lot of these
Agreed.
things that are flagrantly in violation of the Constitution. Now, we'll see how that goes with a executive that doesn't care about judicial review and does not respect the democratic principles laid out in our Constitution. But I guess we'll get to that bridge maybe at a later time.
Well, I totally agree, and I really appreciate you guys' perspective on these things. And moving from expression to privacy and due process, let's look a little more into moving on to the Fourth and Fifth Amendment issues here. You can see, and I'll just give a couple examples. The Mar-a-Lago search warrant case, okay, raised some interesting Fourth Amendment questions. And so for the group, how do you think that the courts approach the facially overbroad claims? Because I think that was the main cause of concern with the Mar-a-Lago search. And we'll start there, and then we'll move into sanctuary cities. And then I have some questions about the 440 plus implications of the Fifth Amendment, which raise questions about the tension between constitutional rights and public accountability, right? So, starting with Mar-a-Lago and the facially overbroad claims that the Trump administration's defense presented.
I know there was a lot of discussion over this particular case, and especially on the right, a lot of them actually think it was warrantless. I'm not sure exactly where they get that from. But of course, Trump's attorney argued that the warrant was overly broad and unjustly allowed them to search the entire Mar-a-Lago. And what that stems from is, the Fourth Amendment protects us from undue search and seizure, and your home, is sort of like that's the cornerstone of it. Like you're the most protected in your house because that's where you have the greatest expectation of privacy, right? And so that's sort of where we start with the Fourth Amendment, and then you essentially see exceptions born out of that. But for a home, like generally, you would need a warrant unless you're like the cops are chasing a felon and they run into your house. That's one of the exceptions. But so anyway, so when you get a when police get a warrant for your house, it has to be supported by probable cause, and so that requires the articulation of facts, right? That constitute probable cause, and it's because your house is such a sacred place, right? You have the greatest expectation of privacy, and the most protected spot. They can't just come in like a one warrant, general warrant, and just go through your whole house. Now they're in your nightstand drawers, So whatever is articulated in the probable cause would be, sort of what they're looking for. So let's say, I'm alleged to have some sort of maybe a weapon that I'm not allowed to have. Let's say, they think that I have a rocket launcher and that, it's illegal and, they want to come in and look for it. A warrant for that would not then allow them to go through, like I said, my nightstand drawers, something like that. So somewhere you would never be able to store an object like that. And so I think that's generally what they're getting at is they're saying, well, the warrant, basically was so broad it just lets them search anywhere and everywhere. Basically, though, what they were looking for is paperwork. So it's not a rocket launcher. You could store it in a lot of places. I mean, I'm trying to think of one place in my house that you do not store paperwork. And honestly, I'm not sure I can think of one. So essentially, it's just another thing that Donald Trump does. Really say anything and everything he can to get out of any sort of accountability or prevent anybody from getting in his way or, you know what I mean? Like, so obviously the warrant, the argument that Donald Trump presented was they were not very legitimate because the judge found that, the warrants were not overbroad and she upheld them. So, Jesse, you want to chime in?
Yeah, so honestly, you also have to look at the cases themselves. And I'm glad we're going over this because I read the not the all the case files because it's very long, the investigations, but I did read this about a month ago. And the cases, while similar, they're extremely different at the same time. Like for one, when we look at both the sheer amount of sizes in terms of how many files were taken home, right? I think Biden was a couple dozen, and Trump's was in the hundreds, right? I think Trump's was with over 300 classified files that he had taken. Also, like there's intent here, right? And there's a long trail of text messages and emails and phone call records, basically that show that there was knowledge and willful intent to take these documents to Mar-a-Lago, right? They were stored, I believe, in the bathroom. They were stored in bedrooms. And we're talking about boxes upon boxes upon boxes. I think there's actual like photos that you can look up now about this kind of stuff. Um, the other thing too is the intent of this. Biden had some of these classified documents for years. He was using them to write books, and in many cases, he didn't realize that they were actually classified. Not to mention that there was a subpoena, obviously, for Trump to comply and for the search warrant and whatnot, whereas Biden, his attorney, willfully called the proper authorities and said, "Hey, we actually have classified documents." It wasn't as if the federal government had discovered it and then did a raid because they needed to. Biden's himself and his lawyer were like, "You know what? We do have documents, by the way." So like very different approaches, very different will of intent. And again, sheer size. Like so there's key differences that make these things very, very different. Um, and I think it's ridiculous that obviously the right will decry like unwarranted searches and seizures. It's just like it's just not what it is. Like if you read the actual investigations, you'll see very clearly that this was willfully done. It was intentionally done.
Yeah, yeah, I can't help but agree. And, I think that on the Fifth Amendment side, we're also seeing challenges to with the withholding of federal funds from sanctuary cities. Again, um, really challenging, and we'll talk about this more as we get into the 10th, but really challenging the rights of states to govern, which for the party of smaller government seems interesting, right? This goes all the way back to the constitutional discussions that predate the Constitution, right? That ended up being what we call the Constitution today in the form of the Federalist Papers, right? An entire summer of very well educated, well informed men debating the merits of federal power versus states' rights, right? And so I think we see some of that with the sanctuary cities. So um, how do the vagueness rulings here connect to constitutional principles in terms of sanctuary cities?
What the vagueness ruling as far as I guess I'm not really familiar with this. Was this still under the fourth? Because I could understand why a vague warrant would not be supported by probable cause. But
Right. Well, the claim in terms of federal withholding of funds is that there are not good enough explanations, that they're uh, too vague, right? The requirements for these injunctions, right? Like, well, that's broad, right? Because they're saying, well, you can't freeze federal funds, and they're saying, well, you know, that's too broad. You can't just tell us we can't freeze funds, right? Which I think goes into a discussion about separation of powers also, but in terms of the constitutional principle, in terms of the Fifth Amendment itself, when it comes to federal power to enforce federal immigration policy, and the state saying, "Hey, these are our policies within the state. We're not going to allow arrests for X, Y, or Z," and then the federal government saying, "Well, we're going to freeze funding," and it seems to me that they're suggesting that they freeze funding that is also not related to immigration.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that do come to mind. I think part of it, and I'm curious to see what Civil has to say about this. It seems like there could be certain violations on multiple fronts, right? Like you said, can he freeze funds that are not necessarily related to these things on grounds that he seems to not really have? That I don't know. I would leave that up to civil, but like I guess it seems obviously in the front that when you withhold funds from states, it's almost as if it's contradictory to the entire Republican platform that he says he has, right? He runs as Republican. And Republicans, traditionally speaking, believe in small government, right? And this is one of the historical perspectives, I guess. They believe traditionally in small government, right? They say that tyranny comes from the federal government and that state governments provide more freedoms for their citizens. And the irony is him using the power of the federal government to threaten state governments. It's so ironic. It's so contradictory to like everything republicanism stands for. Um, and again, this is why I don't think this is also like a huge surprise because I would make the argument anyway that Trump is not a Republican. There's almost nothing in terms of policy that Trump has that is Republican. I would just argue that the Republican Party has been hijacked by a more nefarious ideology that is MAGA, which is something else completely, I would argue. But yeah, it's just weird. It's weird how it's complete contradictory to what the Republican Party has been saying for so long about, federal government versus state government.
Fully agree. Fully agree. And what did you have on that,
Yeah,
Sybil?
yes. So I guess I could see it, so basically, when they're getting these funds on a regular basis, and so then all of a sudden they're being pulled. So I guess in that regard, I can see a due process violation coming out of that, where, it's really what's the word they use? There's a particular word, and I can't think of it. Well, basically it's like shoot, the word is right there on the tip of my tongue. It's often used in a due process challenge. Not for some reason I can't see. But basically it's like, it's the arbitrary. That's what it's arbitrary, they're doing it's not related, if that makes sense. So they're not pulling funding because they've been misappropriated or et cetera. So they're pulling funding uh, without an opportunity, like without a particular accusation related to that and a chance to defend it, if that makes sense. So I can
Mm.
see where like the vagueness might apply there. At first I was thinking, I'm thinking about the Fifth Amendment. I mean, I'm like due process, but yeah, I could see that. I think most of the time when you talk about these funding freezes, we analyze it under the context of the First Amendment, especially with like the DEI requirements, is trying to prevent the exercise of speech. Um, but yeah, so I could kind of see it with that. I think, like I said, usually I just think about the First Amendment when I'm going through these. But yeah, I think that's all I have on that one.
Okay. Yeah. No, and it's no that and that's okay. And I think just discussing really these kind of patterns as we start connecting these, and maybe we can work on that a little bit towards the end. And our discussion moves now to jury rights and federal overreach concerns, right? So we have the New York criminal prosecution, and this now is moving into the Sixth and 10th Amendment concerns, right? So again, the Trump administration, clearly attacking constitutional rights and principles in the Constitution, and we have questions about that we would like to see settled by legal professionals with the proper amount of insight and due process, as we were just discussing. And so, in the New York criminal prosecution, the jury instruction disputes in the New York criminal case have raised Sixth Amendment questions. Okay, so what are the constitutional dimensions of unanimity requirement challenges?
So, the Sixth Amendment, the right to a trial by jury, it doesn't actually mention, unanimity, but essentially, essentially just guarantees the right to a jury. And I think the unanimity is born out of probably case law. Um, because what's the point in having a 12-person jury if just, five can convict you? I think that's in my guess, that's where it comes from. I don't think we touched on this much when I was in school, but yeah, I think it's just case law. It looks like.
Yeah, so as we discuss sanctuary jurisdictions, return to sanctuary jurisdictions through kind of a different lens. How do the anti-coercion principles under the 10th Amendment differ from the Fifth Amendment concerns?
I was going to touch on the due process thing, but we
Okay,
could.
go ahead. Go
Oh, uh, I was just going to say from a historical perspective about the due process. I know, generally speaking, in court cases, historically speaking, that have protected due process for all people. These court cases have usually mentioned, um, I mean, depending on the court case, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and 14th Amendment. Um, and I found I just wanted to make the comment that I have found that a lot of Trump supporters and MAGA right leaning tend to, and I'm assuming this obviously goes all the way back up to the White House, almost as if due process isn't afforded to immigrants. It's not afforded to anyone who is a criminal at times. And I just want to make the comment that obviously, legally speaking, obviously, I know Civil can speak to this, but also historically speaking, this is obviously not the case. And I just think it affirms, yet again, the violation of constitutional law, right, is what the whole topic is. And it's kind of appalling. It's appalling because there's a very long precedent of due process being established, and it's clear that Trump is trying to circumvent this, right? I know we talked about this previously in the other panel the other day, but this is not only established, obviously, in British common law for a very long time, but obviously was the sentiment amongst the founding fathers. Like we could talk about John Quincy Adams and how he defended the British soldiers who committed the Boston Massacre of 1770, and how he was heavily criticized for this, right? Because they felt that he was defending the enemy, and yet he wasn't doing it for the enemy. He was doing it because he had truly believed that everyone deserves due process, regardless of where you're from, right? And it's very telling considering that the British soldiers obviously were not from the United States. They were not colonists. They were direct subjects from England, and yet they received due process here in the colonies under the court of law that exists here in Boston, which is very telling. And of course, this has been played out again and again and again through several court cases. Just to name a few for the audience, if you guys are interested, Yick Wo versus Hopkins is a big one. Wong Wing versus the United States. Plyler versus Doe. These cases span from the 1800s to the 2000s. And every one of them, while very different in what the cases entailed, all of them, at least at some point, was established by the Supreme Court to extend due process to all people, regardless of any status, whether you're undocumented, legal, citizen, whatever case may be.
It's funny. One thing we were going over the Fifth Amendment just now. I was just thinking very limited, like in the context we were already talking about with the warrants and the funding and the federal funding. I didn't even realize that we glossed over the biggest one that we've been talking about. I think that everybody's been talking about with immigration and deportation. So I'm glad that you went back there because what would a Fifth Amendment conversation be without talking about that one? My goodness, but I'm glad you caught that. Um, yeah, I mean, and obviously, all of the civil rights are meant to protect democracy. You know what I mean? Of course, definitely personal freedom, but also just on the broader scale, protect democracy because if anybody can criminalize you for something that somebody said you said, or just lob a heinous accusation at you, and then you don't get due process, and they rendition you to El Salvador, there would never be any political opposition, you know. Um, so that's really a huge one in the context that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean,
And
also from a sorry.
oh no, I was just gonna say even the unanimity, I think that's been. Because I'm sitting here, I'm like, I'm trying to think back to the cases that I remember as sort of like cornerstone cases for that one. And I'm like, it's just a thing. I just know it to be a thing. But I think that's just because, like, I was just going back and looking at it. It's because it's just so old. Like, it's something that's just been, it's just been the case for so long as has been borne out in our system with Supreme Court cases. It's just always been accepted. So that's why I'm like, I can't think of any major cases, but that's because it's just been around so long. There were a lot of cases I know to state trials because the civil rights, the Bill of Rights rather, is they have applied to the federal government. The 14th Amendment that applies them to states. So there was some litigation over state laws that only required like a 10-2, conviction, but uh, but yeah, that's all. Like, I wish I remember the case law on this, but that's why. So yeah, the due process thing. It's like, I, it's like, how would you ever tell how would you tell anybody that you're a citizen if you don't get a chance to tell them? They could just say they never told me. I didn't have any proof, and the next thing you know, you're in El Salvador doing labor for the rest of your life.
Right. Well, also from like a logical perspective, how do you know someone's a criminal if they haven't gone through due process? Right. So, and I think this we would be doing ourselves a disservice by not extending due process to everyone because should someone break the law, even if they are undocumented, let's take immigration for example. Let's say they cross the border and they commit a crime we would have to do due process to know that they committed a crime, right? If we just deport them with no crime, how do we know that they're repeat offenders? Well, we wouldn't know if we don't have due process. So like it's not just for them or for the sake of the law, it's the sake for our own safety to be able to say, hey, we have correctly and properly identified legitimate threats to society. We've gone through the legal avenues to establish that. Now, if they commit it again, we can compound their history on top of their new charges, right? It's it's just ridiculous. It wouldn't make sense if we don't have due process. Not only would we also be obviously falsely and incorrectly imprisoning innocent people, we wouldn't be able to identify who is the criminal.
Agreed.
Right.
Agreed. And along that vein, and here's a question, right? Is kind of a from the other side. What would you say to people who would say that, well, they committed a crime as soon as they crossed the border, uh, not at a point of entry?
So this is under Title 8 U.S. Code 1325, so 1325. There's a couple classifications in there about crossing the border. Most of them are illegal. They're listed as a Class B misdemeanor. And there's another code, U.S. code, that will classify those as well. Um, it depends. It really depends how this is done. And the reason why we say this is because in most cases, it is true. Crossing the border at a place that is not a point of entry or designated by an inspection officer is a criminal charge. It is breaking the law. However, there are clauses under the asylum laws of Title 8 U.S. Code 1158 that do give some leeway to this. So people do have up to 1 year after having crossing the border to claim asylum. And once they do that, that actually no longer becomes a criminal one, but a civil matter. And this is straight up. You can look this up on these codes. It literally says civil offense. It does not say criminal if you apply for asylum. So what I tend to tell people is it depends. It depends what the case is, right? If they cross the border and do not go to an inspection officer and do not go through a port of entry and remain here in the United States past the 1 year, yes, this is a crime, right? This is a Class B misdemeanor. And then again, there's if you want to look at reentry laws, you can look at 1326. Those are alien reentry laws, and the classification for the crimes for repeat offenders who consistently cross the border or more than once at least, this is classified as a felony. Depending on your history and how many times you have done this, that the classification of the felony would be determined by the courts. That's just law.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. And I think that again, it comes back to that due process, and I dare say, when in doubt, due process, right?
That's cute.
I think,
That one, and that's just law. That's gonna be my new
I mean,
that's
phrases.
just
honestly,
law.
when
And
you
that's
are
just law.
when
So I
you
got
are
it.
sure due process, right? Like I tell people all the time, and not to get off topic, but people always tell me about like how come Trump was never like convicted for January 6th? So much evidence, huh? And my thing is, do you ever wonder why like mass shooters, it takes years to put them behind bars? Like it takes years to like build the case. We have video, we have literally the smoking gun. We know he did this, but why does it take so long? Because these, and I'm sure, Civil, I'm stealing your thunder here because I'm sure you know this better than I do. It takes a lot of time to build these cases properly. Like you have to make the case, you have to compile the evidence, you have to make your narrative, you have to establish motive, you have to bring this before the court, like through the proper process and channels. And it takes time.
Yeah.
They also are going to have a defense attorney. They're going to have their narrative and they're going to have their stuff and their witnesses. Like in all of this could still be like the ball could still be dropped. You could have a solid claim. Like we could literally point to OJ and say that the DA's office in California had a phenomenal case against him, right? And even yet, still, sometimes we can say it may not go the way you think, despite all the evidence. And this is why these things take time. This is why due process is such a very arduous process to make sure that we do it to the full extent of the law.
Yeah. Especially because, if you drop the ball, you're not going to get a chance. So, it's funny. I always wonder why so many criminal defendants waive their right to a speedy trial. And I'm like, if, especially if they don't have a smoking gun, I'd be like, nope, nope, let's keep going. So it would make, it gives the prosecution less time to build the case properly. But, um, but yeah, so I think one thing we also didn't touch on with the sanctuary cities, and maybe I don't know if you mentioned that, that's where you mentioned the vagueness. Uh, I think that is where you mentioned the vagueness, and now I'm putting it together in my head. Uh, you know, laws laws can be unconstitutionally vague, and what that is, if they have a law that criminalizes something, if you don't know, if you can't tell clearly what sort of behavior violates that, then they could essentially, put you in jail for anything, that even remotely relates to it. So I think that was so the premise on that is they have to know exactly what compliance looks like. So it's one thing I wanted to point out that
Yeah, yeah. I think those are all uh, very important points along these veins. And I think, one of the things that I have questions about specifically as we look at federal government oversight, Executive Order 14215, which, required independent agencies to align with White House priorities, right? And so I'd like to know how this challenges the constitutional design of independent agencies and the risks involved with making such a demand on a system that wasn't intended for that.
I would love to touch on this one real quick.
I don't know, right? Please, everybody, the independent agencies really scare me. So go ahead, just yeah, that's not okay.
I want to kind of bring us back, obviously, to the founding fathers and the founding documents. I think we as a society, we as an American people we have to get away from falling into the trap of trying to parse the Constitution word for word. What I mean by that is we try to we try to be true to the Constitution, but I think we do it in a very incorrect way. What I mean by that is when we try to interpret it, we try to do it from an originalist perspective for certain parts of it. Then we try to approach it with a textualist perspective from another part of it. Um, and I think the important thing is to capture the spirit of what our founding fathers really wanted. Now, I say all that because when we're talking about the executive branch, right, it is very clear that from the founding fathers that some wanted a very strong executive branch and other ones wanted kind of a weak one because they were afraid of a repeat of King George, right? But the important thing is that the founding fathers weren't just afraid of a king, they were afraid of tyranny. Because if we remember correctly, the taxes that were passed weren't just King George, they were the Parliament in England as well. And they would argue that the Parliament passed laws of tyranny on them as well. So there's the reason why we have a system of checks and balances between the branches is specifically because of this. Because tyranny can come from the executive as well as the congressional one. But for now, let's focus obviously on the executive one. There's there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people were very afraid of the executive branch. Point in case, everyone was very happy, relieved, and in awe when George Washington had stepped down after his 2 terms, right? Because we didn't know. There was uncertainty, a palpable uncertainty at that time, whether or not he would step down from his power, and have a peaceful transfer of power, which, if you really think about it, is a human miracle I don't know of another time in human history where power was so willingly given to another man so easily. And this continues to happen time and time again, every single term between new incoming and outgoing presidents, which is absolutely amazing. Anyway, the point I'm trying to get at is having said that, because of that fear throughout the course of American history, there have been restrictions on the executive power in terms of what they can do, whether it be different matters in of state, matters of the nation, of the federal government, and also within itself. This is specifically why, especially in the 20th century, multiple agencies were established that were independent of the president himself, even within the executive branch, right? This is very, very, very clear. We know this was done intentionally. This is why we have inspector generals, whose pure definition is to be independent offices that look at waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption within their respective agencies. This is why we have other agencies that are supposed to be independent, like the FTC, the FCC, the SEC, so on and so forth, right? And the reason why they are independent is because while they are under the direction per se, or the indirect direction of the president, they're supposed to be independent to carry out their duties successfully, right? Away from political interference. I think this is extremely important because when you start to politicize career jobs, you begin to instill loyalists in those jobs as opposed to merit. And the whole irony about this administration is that he's trying to instill a meritocracy, or so he says, while what he really wants is an army of loyalists inside of every branch, inside of every corner, every office, every agency. And this is super dangerous for a multitude of reasons. He can manipulate it. He could potentially ask these people to do something unlawful, and they will comply. And the last thing I want to say to prove my point about this, and then I'll let Civil take over because I'm sure she has a lot to say as well, is a really good example of this is actually for Trump in particular in December of 2020, after he had lost the election. Trump went to the director of the DOJ and had specifically asked him to send out letters saying that the DOJ had found fraudulent ballots across 7 states, and he disagreed. He was like, I'm not going to do this, so he was fired. In his place were two directors, Rosen and Donahue, were put in December in order to fulfill Trump's agenda, but they didn't know what Trump wanted until Trump had asked them. When they had refused, Trump had went to a subordinate called Jeffrey, I forgot his last name, but I believe his name is Jeff, and told him that he would give him the position of the DOJ if he sends out these letters. The guy complied. He was like, yeah, I'll absolutely do this. And he had a hot-headed moment where he went to his superiors and said, guess what? I'm going to get your job, and Trump's going to let me do this because I'm going to do his bidding. Well, he was fired before he could get the job, and this never fell through. Right. But this is one example of why independence is such a big deal within the executive branch because of these types of things. Had this happened, perhaps the 2020 to 2021 transfer of power would have looked very, very, very different. And this poses a huge threat to democracy in our democratic norms. Now that Trump is starting his second term, he is doing this with impunity. He is with Schedule F, which allows him to politicize. I think you guys said over 50,000 career jobs, so he can put in whoever he wants, putting people on leave, having them go loyalty test, taking away union bargaining power. He's clearly consolidating his grip and his power over the federal government in a spirit, in manner, in speed, in way that is completely contrary to the spirit of the American Constitution.
Yeah, all these conversations we're having with people on TikTok, and they say, well, yeah, I voted for him but this time, but yeah, some of them say, well, I didn't know he was going to do this or what have you. And I'm like, there's just no way you watch the first term unless you just absolutely put your head in the sand or you just cover your ears and you're like, well. It was so clear that he had the propensity for authoritarianism, that this is what he was going to do. It's so frustrating that we're back here now. And it's just, honestly, it's worse than I think even most people who knew that he was a threat, I think it's even worse than what than we thought it could be. And so especially with the federal independent agencies, all agencies and departments are a delegation of congressional authority, which is why when he does what he's doing to them, like fighting air. Um, and so that's why you see inspectors general and things like that, because it, I mean, they said those positions are not purely executive positions, as you mentioned, uh, and also these things are just it's in contravention to the statutes that created them. For example, the FEC was created with a statute, the Federal Election Campaign Act, and so it sets it as independent. And so I still can't imagine how he's doing what he's doing and is not being stopped. Because when you see him getting rid of the IGs and he's the final arbiter now of any rules or regulations. How are we expected to have a free and fair election when you have somebody who, you know, when the election is like for that office, and then they get to control rules and regulations around that office, or being elected to the office. So it's very clearly unconstitutional to me. I think to the courts as well, because you see these injunctions being entered left and right. It's almost like the court's like, yeah, I don't even have to read the briefing to know that this isn't right. So all these things together is just like the most comprehensive assault on our democracy that I think that I've ever seen or even could have contemplated.
Yeah, I mean,
Quite wild.
I think to add to your point, I think one of the reasons why people go along with it is, I've said this before. I think what we're experiencing now is a classical issue with modern catalysts. Like, this is nothing new. Democracies voting for strong dictatorial characters is nothing new, right? Like this is one of the biggest criticisms that Plato had back when democracy was first invented. He thought it was a horrible form of government because he said one of the reasons is because the people he believed would be dumb enough to vote for someone who would end democracy itself, which is the irony because this has happened consistently within the 20th century, right? And we see this throughout history as well, where like different democratic societies will elect very strong uh, um, rulers because it's usually particularly in times of crises. I mean, it's not even necessarily a modern thing. We can hark back to Rome. Rome is a good example of this. They had voting, they had democracies, yet they instilled dictators in times of war, right? They still flirted with this like authoritarian figure. So like this is a very classical issue. When people are driven to disparity, when they're driven to economic woes and hunger, when they're driven to fear, they tend to look for a particular figure that will lead them out of the chaos, right? And I think Trump is exactly that, right? And I would argue he hijacks legitimate sentiments that exist, um, and he also fabricates narratives that create and incentivize more fear, essentially for this specific purpose. And it's just a complete danger to our entire constitutional order.
Yeah, it is. It's funny. I was before I came here tonight, me and a bunch of law school alumni had asked one of our common law professors if he'd be willing to, have a get together, talk about what's going on. And as we went through everything, we talked about it. It was like, okay, so the conclusion is like, yeah, this is as bad as it looks. And I was like, I shouldn't even have went to that. I can't have feeling worse.
Yeah, I think that a lot of these things are very concerning for a number of Americans, especially those of us who swore an oath to support, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Which brings us to another very interesting concept. What is domestic, right? So we have all these challenges now to the 14th Amendment, and it includes some of the most direct conflicts with the text of the Constitution. When we talk about the executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship for children of non-citizens, which was blocked as blatantly unconstitutional. Could you elaborate on the citizenship clause's text and interpretation for us?
Yeah. So the part, I don't know if you want me to like read say the whole thing, but the part that they're hoping to bank on is subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And it, they're trying their hardest. I mean, first and foremost, in what world under our framework can a president change the interpretation of the black letter law, of the Constitution? That's insane right there alone. But that's what he's doing. He's hoping that, I guess I'm sure he knew it would be challenged, hoping that the Supreme Court will change the always historically accepted interpretation of it, and specifically to that particular provision. Without that provision, there's like no way to change it, right? But that's funny. I remember one of the lower courts was like, your interpretation has never ever been accepted anywhere in this nation, and this court won't be the first. And so the thing is, though, this idea is predates the United States. We got it from British common law, as we did so many other things. And so it was a widely accepted principle when we ratified this amendment. The Dred Scott decision sort of highlighted, a hole where people were slipping through, or they could arguably have been slipping through. So it did kind of bring up the conversation, but ultimately we already had this and we accepted this, and so it was written very broadly and amended. I mean, I'm sorry, ratified. So this one, I mean, I think the Supreme Court will just have to absolutely twist themselves in a pretzel to the point of delegitimizing the court if it's not already, as a partisan institution. And so in order to ratify his interpretation, it's just insane, which, some people would argue they're already twisting themselves up pretty well. So I guess we will see how it goes. I know you probably have something on this, Jesse.
Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned, the Supreme Court, and I don't know. I don't, yeah, I don't know. It makes me nervous to think the historical precedent and where this could potentially go for a constitutional crisis. I know many people say that we are in a constitutional crisis right now, and I personally don't think we are just yet, but it's more out of like a technicality, not like in the spirit of it. In the spirit, I think we're in a huge crisis, right? But in terms of technical, I think Trump is the only reason why he's not complying with the court is because El Salvador is a black hole, right? Not because he's blatantly going against it. So I think he's using that as his cover, right? Everyone knows that he's doing this intentionally, but I think legally speaking, he's playing a game with the courts. And I just hate that. I think it's super dangerous. I think it defies everything we stand for. And it's clear he does it with joy, and it's just atrocious.
Yeah, I agree. He's been doing it well, I don't know, since he got in office, really, with the USA case, like sort of trying to dance around nuance. So it is frustrating for me. It's frustrating for me. I don't know, I think the courts they should have taken maybe a little bit of a bolder stance and slapped the hand of this administration a long time ago, prevent some of this consolidation of power we're seeing, because the further it goes, the worse it's going to be, the harder to resist it. So I think I see what you're saying though, as far as, I guess the stronger claim for a law, like say, like this one's from the black letter law of the Constitution versus say Roe being an implied right, you know, it's just going to be harder and harder for the Supreme Court to rule in his favor without pretty much putting it on the table that they're going to give him whatever he wants. But I don't know. I have a little faith in the Supreme Court at first, but it's eroding. It's eroding.
But yeah, I think that birthright citizenship and the citizenship clause, right, are just a part of it. But then we also have the entire equal protections part where, you have executive orders limiting federal support for people trying to transition. And the courts have cited equal protection laws in their injunction against that. So how do you see that playing a part in what we're seeing throughout this conversation as an overall attack on constitutional rights? And how do the what will become the ultimate court decisions of these major cases, the 14th being one that'll be heard by the Supreme Court on the 15th, how do the outcomes really heavily impact the future of the United States as a country?
Well, one thing I do want to mention about the gender affirming care is I think the fundamental basis of his approach is flawed, right? And it's clear, it's very, very clear that he's trying to restore a culture, right? He's very open about this idea of, again, this ethno-nationalist, Christian nationalist culture that he's trying to preserve. This is why he passes the executive order of there only being two genders, male and female. And I don't know what any of this has to do with protecting freedoms, right? If we go back to the fundamental principles of what a government is, when we talk to, let's say, somebody like Abraham Lincoln, right? He says he was the one who coined the term, I believe, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? And it's this idea that like the government's existence since its inception is to protect the freedoms of the people. I don't know what denying gender affirming care has to do with protecting other people's freedoms, right? I think the fundamental basis of how he approaches these things is flawed, and I think ultimately will lead to his demise because male.
So what I was saying to Jesse is, this whole idea that like American is this certain culture, right? This Christian, you know, white male dominated, or white male led, nuclear family, marriages between a man and woman. This whole idea is not really new. No, it's not. It's not. It's not really new. It's not new at all. It's somewhere along the way they wrote this beautiful Constitution, the oldest, surviving written charter in the world, the beacon on the hill of democracy. And then you see right now, like we'll tear it apart to preserve the culture that we see as American. And this is, but the thing is, like they've done this for a while, right? That's why we have laws, or we have case law to preserve the right for interracial marriage and all of these things, because all of those laws were in those same, like they're in the same vein as what we're talking about now. We had those things because the white majority in these states were like, no, that's not American. We outlaw that. And it's, they want to outlaw interracial marriage, gay marriage. They're outlaw really the methods of sex that were traditionally considered gay, contraception, abortion, like all these things. So we've seen this for a while, and I think we were heading down the right road for a minute, but then we had Roe overturned. They're going to try to overturn Obergefell. I do wonder at this point, are they going to try to overturn Loving versus Virginia? At some point, is my marriage going to be illegal again? I don't know, because it's like it's almost like the culture thing. The culture thing was sort of their thing the whole time, right? But oh, the Constitution that they wrote was kind of holding in there. Like, okay, Constitution was holding up and then hamstringing them, I guess. And so they're finally like, we'll just get rid of the whole thing then. But Jesse also had some good points on that as well. I don't know if you want to
Yeah,
rehash.
no, no, absolutely. Yeah, we were talking about this briefly, and part of it is, Civil's 100% right that this has always been a thing in America where there's always been this preservation of this culture, right? This predominantly white Christian male dominated culture kind of thing. This is very, very true. Generally concentrated on the conservative side. Any party throughout the American history that has been relatively conservative, this has usually been concentrated on their side. Not to say that it has not happened on the liberal side, because that's also not true. But it does seem that like there's, we could talk about, like I was saying to Civil earlier, like when we hark back all the way to Abraham Lincoln, it was true that the Republicans in the North did believe that like equality under the law was extended to blacks, that they should be free because it was a contradiction in the Constitution to say that all men are created equal and therefore are given rights that are inalienable given to them by God, and yet have people that are enslaved. Um, But even then, there was a distinction back then between different types of rights, correct? Right. So there was legal rights, there were social rights, there were worker rights, kind of thing. And that while it was true that under the Constitution, a black man should be free under the law and equal under the law, this didn't necessarily mean that he was intellectually equal, that he was socially equal. So even then, even in that time, you have a very, very strong cultural sentiment of this idea of the preservation of this dominant race, of this dominant ideology and culture and whatnot. And it has persisted throughout American history, right? Even at the turn of the 20th century with the eugenics movement, right? The purification of the white race. And, there was a very intentional drive from the presidency to Congress to universities of trying to see if we can create almost like a master race within America through the eugenics movement, which eventually did die off. But I mean, it persisted for a couple decades, which is insane. And we kind of still see this today, right? We see this today with MAGA and Trumpism that yet again, it's almost like a regeneration under new clauses and new terminology of a preservation of this culture that is clearly ethno-nationalist, white dominant, Christian dominant. It's apparent even in his executive orders that he passed recently about defunding and stripping the ideology, the woke ideology away from the African American Smithsonian Museum. While in the same executive order, under one of the later sections, specifically calling for the reinstallation and reinstitution of the American hero memorials that have been, taken down since 2020 throughout the South. I mean, what are we talking about here? We're talking about Confederates, right? We're talking about, and we're not just talking about like, you know, the Robert E. Lees. We're talking about Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy. We're talking about Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president, who wrote the Constitution and who wrote founding documents for the Confederate Constitution, which were fundamentally racist. It was insane, some of the things that he wrote in there, that he believed that the natural subjugation and the natural place, rather, of the black man was the subjugation under the white man, which is it's wild. So yeah, Civil's 100% right. This has always been a thing throughout American history, that there's always been an attempt at preservation. It was true under Reagan after the Civil Rights Movement. There was like this callback to try to bring America back to its traditional cultural values, and it's happening yet again, I think, under Trump. And I think a lot of this is happening because the progressive liberal movement has made huge strides, right? It's made great advances in society, and yet we have this other clash of a preservation of culture that is, I think, in Trumpism in particular, is particularly uh, apt and willing and ready to subvert the rule of law to preserve that culture.
Yeah, so the nerve of them to call them American heroes, am I right? I know they're gaslighted by
Yeah,
this nation. I mean, by this regime, but yes, and like to your original point, what does this have to do with protecting rights? Exactly. What does outlawing gay marriage have to do with protecting other people's rights?
right.
Gay sex. I mean, what are we even talking about? So nothing to do with other people's rights, but it's funny because they are actually couching their arguments in protecting other people's rights. They're couching the trans argument in protecting girls' rights, women's rights,
Mhm.
And honestly, I think it's just kind of crazy to even watch what's happening. But like I said, it's funny that the document they wrote was actually it was working. It was working, and progression was happening, and liberties and freedoms were being more and more protected. And so now, I think that's why they're just like actually, they're like fuck it. Oh, so sorry. Dang. Actually, they're like, well, we'll just get rid of this then because it's been hamstringing what we really want. Uh, and I think also just the additional competition that happened whenever equality was started taking place, and now white men have to compete with women, have to compete with minorities, and they just like let this resentment build up to the point they're like, actually, you know what, we're gonna get rid of this so we can do what we want and get rid of y'all.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think that of course uh consolidation of power is obviously a big part of this. And so beyond specific amendments within the Constitution, Let's examine the foundational separation of powers conflicts, right? So, judicial independence, congressional authority, constitutional structure. And beginning with judicial independence, the administration's criticism of judges and defiance of court orders raises, I mean, for me, very serious concerns. How does this affect the judiciary's constitutional role?
Well, I mean, pretty significantly. Uh, as you, I'm sure, are aware, the Constitution lays out one Supreme Court. Other than that, inferior courts are created by Congress. So there's already a little blurring between the legislative and the judicial role right there. And judicial review is not explicitly laid out in the Constitution. I think it is inferred. I think it's a natural uh, derivation from it, but it could be a little fragile, especially when you have a complicit legislator. Uh, when I often talk about the Supreme Court as being a nonpartisan institution, and that's where it derives its a legitimate authority to be the arbiter of disputes between the other two branches. Because if you partisan it, and this is what I was saying earlier about them changing the interpretation of birthright citizenship. When people stop believing, when we have uh no more like respect for them, when we think they're a partisan institution, it's just like at that point, we kind of wonder where's democracy gone? Because if he can do whatever he wants, and then his partisan Supreme Court is going to let him, I mean, at that point, Congress is irrelevant, right? They can write whatever laws and sign them. He can refuse to enforce them like he's doing right now with the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act, or he can operate in contravention to them like he's doing right now with everything else. And that a lot of right, that's their argument. Well, he's just being, that's how you test things. That's how you get things overturned or what have you. The Supreme Court, we'll see what they say because they believe that the Republicans own the Supreme Court right now. So where is democracy? Where is the separation of powers? What does anything else mean if he could do whatever he wants? They're going to say he could do it and we have no other recourse, you know? So I think it's a travesty, like, especially because, like I said, with inferior courts being created by Congress, now Congress wants to go messing with their authority in order to let him do what he wants without regard for the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. To speak a little bit more on that last part that you mentioned, it's kind of appalling that Congress is so willing to jump the NORA Act, which I believe is HR 1526 right now, that has already passed the House and is in the Senate right now. Um, it's very short. It's a short bill. It's 3 pages. I recommend anybody to read it. And it essentially does a few things, but the main thing that it really does is, yeah, it limits it limits district courts from filing nationwide injunctions, which has been a thing for like over a century. It's been a thing for a very, very long time, with good reason too, right? And it's
And
so
wielded by both parties at
right,
will.
right, exactly. Wielded by both parties, 100%. Like we could talk about how FDR was trying to pass the New Deal through several pieces of key legislations, and the Supreme Court and federal courts were stopping him almost at every turn. And it was very frustrating for him, which is why he waged that war on them, politically speaking, at least. It's always been a thing. It's always been a thing, and their willingness to go along with this authoritarian overreach is appalling. It's crazy. It's wild. It's un-American, and I don't understand. I don't understand how they're doing so willingly. It's very weird.
It is weird. And I don't, man, do you mind if I go ahead and go into the congressional authority?
No, do it.
Because,
Yeah,
because,
yeah, please do.
because, so this is what I was thinking about earlier with our professor. You know, he's usurping Congress's authority. I mean, daily, right? Uh, impounding funds, you know, tearing down agencies and departments, firing IGs, doing things he does not have the authority to do because in the Constitution, we all know the very limited scope of his role outside of foreign relations and things like that. You know, take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Faithfully. That means in, congruence with the fucking oh, dang it, sorry. So we know that his authority under the Constitution is limited. It's take care that the laws are faithfully executed. They'd be faithfully executed in congruence with the will of Congress, as laid out in the statute. So the idea that you could just not enforce the statute, or that you could change anything about, the goal or the purpose of the statute is crazy. It's like that it doesn't comport with it. And then the power of the purse, it's literally written in the Constitution. It's the black letter law. So the idea that he can do that, because not only is he impounding funds, but tariffs are also the power of the purse. He can only wield that power because Congress has created, essentially a deference to him when there's a state of emergency. Well, he has perverted that. He's claimed a state of emergency when there is none. But the craziest thing to me is that Congress is giving him more power. Like literally, oh, that wasn't enough here. Not only are they not going to fight him taking it on his own, they're giving it to him. For example, when we passed the CR, they put in there a provision that perverted the standard of like what's a day. And so they hamstringed the Democrats' ability to call a vote to end the emergency. Then they removed earmarks from funding and didn't put any more earmarks on there that essentially created a discretionary funding like slush fund. And I'm like, this is unconstitutional. But I started thinking today, we know that he can't usurp it, but can they give it to him? Is this how it goes? Is this how we go down? Because the framers of the Constitution assumed that each branch would not cede its power, but it is. So who has standing to stop it? Are they required? The Supreme Court decide that they're required to stand up for their power, or can we watch democracy fail because two branches collude? I don't know. Jesse. Oh,
I don't know. I've not decided philosophically whether or not if a people decide to end their freedoms, does it merit and warrant that end? You know what I mean? I don't know. It's super philosophical that I've not arrived to a conclusion yet because I don't know.
Right.
I don't know if a people decide to intentionally and knowingly, with full reason and logic, to vote against their own interest, do we allow it to happen? Or do we adhere to larger principles of freedom? Like, I don't know. I don't know. You bring up a really good point. Like to see Congress and the executive team up essentially to install an authoritarian regime almost. Um, uh, the only thing that gives me hope is like besides the courts is the public outcry, right? If the public were more united in their voice, let's say it was like 70% of the population that would go along with this, I would question more, be like, maybe we should, because this is majority rules, right? But it's not, right? It's not, that's not what's going on right now. There is a huge outcry in the public sphere against this, and I'm very encouraged by that. But I don't know. It's a gray area, I guess.
Yeah, and but did we vote for it, right? I mean, okay, yeah, they apparently as a nation we elected Trump, but did anybody foresee Congress just going belly up and ceding all of their power? I don't know. I don't know that we did, but maybe I guess if we don't have an outcry big enough, I guess maybe we did. Uh, I don't know. I never thought about it like that until I was with our professor earlier and we were talking about it, and I'm like, dang man, I feel like if we could still trust the courts, if they've not abdicated, I feel like we should have standing to force Congress to check an executive, but it's just such an unprecedented event that I'm just not sure we'll have time to figure it out. Because especially, if it were just like, okay, he's doing these things, but we could have a midterm. But it's not looking like we're going to have a free and fair midterm. Especially when you look at the forces that were the architect of what we're seeing. The Project 2025, the 900 pages that we saw, that's just the greased machine for the first 6 months. But if you look deeper into the ideologies behind that movement, it's absolutely not one of a continuing United States democracy. So, oh man, honestly, I can't believe I'm living in this timeline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there was something else I was going to say about this, I think, but I don't know. It might come back to me. Um, but yeah, I mean, just left and right, they're doing it. And if they're not just letting him get by, they're lobbing him some more power. So,
Yeah, I fully agree. And now we've got several instances where the administration has been held in contempt. What remedies exist when one branch is held by another? And what institutional safeguards have proven most and least effective in protecting these things?
you know, I started to just go into this part just now, but uh, honestly, it's like it's the bow on top of what have we done here? I feel like there should have been, you know, now I know they probably maybe didn't have this forethought, this insight when we wrote this bad boy, but man, the inability for other people to, have some absolute redress to prevent Congress from doing this, from giving him power, and them collaborating on this coup. Like, I feel like we should be able to call it a special election or do something. But it's really not a lot there. So we're doing the best we can, filing all the lawsuits. Which to go back to that act we were talking about with the courts, they didn't fully take away. They could eliminate federal courts. As they said, we could eliminate funding, this and that, and the thought of that is a little bit also terrifying. But essentially, like they're going to make us litigate in every circuit in order to cover the nation. Which, for example, birthright citizenship. So I think it was like 22 states sued. So in those 22 states, babies born would be citizens, and in the rest they wouldn't. What kind of chaos is that? But anyhow,
That's a good point.
yes,
Consider that. It's wild.
yeah, right. So and this happens to the country, something's illegal, and the other half it's not. What? Okay. Anywho, so yeah, so the courts have been holding the line, and at first I was like, man, I'm just so proud, so proud of the courts. Lawyers and courts are just that's the army right now. But lower courts are bound by precedents, and so even the most partisan judge would not. I mean, they would absolutely be overturned if they ruled in a way that was uh, against the precedent. So I think maybe the initial bit of hope I have is sort of a little bit just more procedural in nature than substantive. And so they're getting injunctions, and then as you see, the Trump administration has appealed some of them, which usually the appellate court would uphold things, or they appeal them to the Supreme Court. But so that's sort of where we're at now. Nothing's been ruled on the merits, but he's violating injunctions and court orders, and so being held in contempt. And then the enforcement mechanism is the U.S. Marshals, which are housed in the executive branch. Why didn't Congress give the Supreme Court like a militia or something? But I feel like just something. But so essentially, what we're going to see is the Supreme Court will tell the U.S. Marshals to go put somebody in custody, and Pam Bondi and everybody else are going to say, "Don't you dare!" And they're probably not going to, because these are just little U.S. Marshals. And after that, that's it. That's it. So Supreme Court orders, like any court order, no longer matters, right? We can sue, they can rule, he can shoot the middle finger at the courts and then do what he wants. And so that's the thing with with Congress abdicating their duty to check him. Uh, if they're not going to impeach him, that's just it until a civil war breaks out. I mean, the if that's it. And
Yeah.
I just never thought about how quick it gets there until I'm sitting here looking at it in the face and I'm like, wow, what a loophole in the Constitution, because it wasn't that hard. It was not that hard, clearly. I hope that Congress finds a spine. I hope that at some point they say, you know what? I love my country. I took an oath to the Constitution. I have a duty here. And they decide that, you know what, oh, you've had your fun. Uh, that'll do. But I don't know if they will. I don't know if they will. I think right now you still see some public support for him and what he's doing because number one, uh, this is what I learned from a conversation on TikTok. Apparently, half the nation has no idea how our government is supposed to work, and they just lack the nuanced, knowledge um, that is the basis of like when I make the argument something's unconstitutional. They don't they no, it's not like they don't understand the nuance, and the part of that is probably because a lot of it is borne out in case law that they've never read, and so there's still some support for it to get to some ideological means, right? I mean, and like to deal with the boogeyman immigration and the DEI, this kind of stuff. But the broader implication, because everyone wants to look at it in a silo. They want to argue this, argue about that, but okay, but the broader implication is that our government's being overthrown. And so I just wonder if Congress is willing to let a little of it happen to get to the ends, or if they're just gonna let it happen until they realize, okay, I'm gonna lose my seat if I keep doing this. With for example, by public outcry, that it makes it clear that they're gonna lose any support. Um, or if they're scared for their life. I'm just not sure. Like, where are they gonna draw a line? And if so, where? Where are you gonna draw the line? Because we're kind of getting a little bit too far over the line, in my opinion. So let me not ramble.
Yeah, I mean, you had said the point earlier. I'm just going to reiterate it. Is I think the weakest point in our system, unfortunately, right now is the Supreme Court, because the only thing that sustains the power in the Supreme Court is adherence to the court, right? And as soon as someone decides not to, where's the consequence, right? Like you said, the U.S. Marshal's office is under the DOJ. And you really think they're gonna activate against against their boss when Pam Bondi is, willing to investigate news outlets and universities, but not Pete Hegseth when he clearly violates the Espionage Act? Like, come on, you know what I mean? I'm actually surprised. Come to think of it, I've compared this to other countries. I am surprised that the United States hasn't created a enforcement body for the Supreme Court. Other countries have this. They have enforcement bodies for their court system, specifically for this reason. It kind of makes sense that it exists for other countries because, to be fair, there is more abuse of power in other countries as opposed to the United States, which is relatively seen as like a stable power. Um, but I am kind of surprised, and I'm wondering if perhaps this is an amendment or a change we should potentially have in our system, that an activated enforcement body should come into effect should a court order from the Supreme Court ruling be enacted or passed, and a body or entity, whether it be federal or not, refuses to comply, that this could be, invoked by the Supreme Court if they so choose. Perhaps this could lead to other things that maybe I'm not looking at, maybe some downfalls or dangers, which I would be more than willing to, look into and be open to listening to. I just, at least like initially, my thoughts, yeah, kind of go to this idea.
So yeah, so uh I think the framers you probably thought so given this idea that they thought no branch would really want to cede its power. I think they just didn't foresee uh two branches colluding in this manner. Um because Congress could impeach him, right? So there's US Marshals and there's impeachment. They could stop what's happening, but they won't. And so maybe they didn't foresee that. And so one thing we were talking about earlier when I was with my professor is would the military step in? And he was like, given the way that they're obviously under the president and that leadership that a hierarchy is so ingrained, chain of command, that it's unlikely that they would just act on their own like that, at, at least initially. But what if we amended it to where you know the military changes, like the Supreme Court commands the military after the Supreme Court orders violated or something. I don't know. This got to be something we could do, but I guess we'd have to really brainstorm on it, Uh,
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. Because especially because even Supreme Court opinions are controversial. A lot of people, you
Absolutely.
know,
Disagree.
don't. Yeah, but we have used our military to enforce them before, but that's the direction of the executive. So I don't know. I'll have to think that one through a little bit more if we get the chance.
The slide that we have up, and this just kind of provides a visual. I didn't put the percentages up, but these are just kind of a piece of the pie, and I thought this was valuable because it kind of shows that it's really a balanced attack on the the amendments that most protect the people against fascist rule, right? The 14th and the perversion of the 14th is being used to target immigrants, both legal and illegal, criminal and non-criminal. We've got students now being targeted as part of the institutional attack. So this just kind of shows that while separation of power, right? So as we know, consolidation of power is an important portion of the uh, unitary presidential theory uh, outlined in Project 2025. And so we see the largest uh, portion of legal challenges surrounding separation of powers, but a relatively equal split around the first, fourth, fifth, sixth, 10th, and 14th. And so I think that's worth noting. It seems to suggest to me that they understand that consolidation of power is the most important aspect and where they've put most of their effort, which leads me to believe that's where we should put most of the effort to counter it. Over.
Well, so the thing about this, right? I think it's helpful to see, but the pie is still a whole. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
yes, they're consolidating power by usurping the power of other branches, but the I'm sorry, the civil rights violations, like I said before, the Bill of Rights, yes, of course, it's about freedom for, nobody wants to, get beat up or stoned to death because they made a social media post calling Trump a tangerine tyrant, especially me. Uh, but they protect democracy. And so, basically, you can't overthrow a government. You can't overthrow a government without suppressing the people, right? And democracy is consent to be ruled. Yeah, that's what it means. And um, if the people uprise against it, which then if the people uprise against I can't stutter. If the people uprise against it, that's the resistance, That's like what it hinges on whether or not they're going to be successful. So that's why you see this concerted effort um to abrogate civil rights. And the rhetoric is so important here because it's like normalizing the violations. So,
Hmm.
for example, the attacking the judicial independence. If they can convince people that the courts are corrupt, they're activists, they're this and that. They're just operating, in the wild. They're doing all this stuff. Then you see it already. People are willing to accept him ignoring court orders. If you can convince the populace that the immigrants are criminals and they're dangerous and they're this and that, then you see the people accepting the abrogation of due process. If we can just, well, the same thing. These immigrants look at them; they're so dangerous. Why? What do you mean? I need a warrant? I can't just snatch them off the street with a ski mask on. People accept violations of the Fourth Amendment. It's just so comprehensive. I mean, it's a well thought out, well planned uh scheme. It's just honestly, it's disheartening that we even got here. I don't know how we got here. Like people didn't see this coming really.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
anyway, so that's why the rhetoric is so important because you see the populace, at least portion of it, saying, yeah, yeah, no, no due process. Well, they don't need freedom of speech. And now, I think targeting immigrants first was, I mean, it's probably just one of the smartest decisions they made because the line is kind of blurred it others somebody, but it doesn't other their neighbor necessarily or their citizen, other citizens. And so the people who are accepting this are accepting it because they think it could never happen to them, right? So if it was just any other citizen, they might have a little more pause, a little more, hold on now. I don't want people to go to jail for Facebook posts, you know. But because it's immigrants, they're like, yeah, it's fine because they think it will happen to them. And that's so nefarious. But it's working really well for them.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And they've done a great job convincing people that, well, really at othering people, as you kind of so aptly pointed out. So, um, really just kind of disturbing all the way around. Not anything we like to see. Or,
You know what? I was sorry. I was gonna make one more point. Uh, I know you hear me say it all the time, and like I said earlier, the oldest, like the oldest surviving written charter on the earth. Like, I mean, I'm not an American exceptionalist person, but I am pretty damn proud at how far we've gotten with this. I think that it hasn't always worked for everybody, and that's a travesty. It definitely needs, we need to figure out how to remedy that. But I mean, nobody else gets to say that. But I wonder now how, the rise of technology, social media, and misinformation, how that played a role in this. How can we regulate that without stepping on the First Amendment? Like we're really at a crossroads here if we make it through this because it's American to have a strong First Amendment. But if it breaks your democracy, you know, I don't
right.
know. That's
I
like that
mean,
has to be discussed.
I could chip in a little bit here. What I do for a day job is I work in IT actually. Um, so the United States has always been a particular area when it comes to the First Amendment. A point of contention is, infringing on any of those rights. I think Europe sets a relatively good example. Europe has much more stricter data privacy laws than the United States. To this day, Google Maps is still not completed in Germany because the German government had found Google driving around, taking pictures and uploading their maps, and Google in Germany was like, "What are you doing?" Google's like, "Oh, we're just doing our maps." They're like, "No, no, no, don't do that," and they stopped them. So, because they had never actually consented with the government whether or not they could do that. Um, there are protections for citizens when it comes to data privacy and certain advertisers and companies accessing data like that. This does not exist in the United States. And I think this is the first step that we can take when it comes to this, which actually protects our First Amendments, right? Instead of getting hijacked by somebody else. But I think to your point about how technology affected this, like I had said previously, a classic issue with modern catalysts, right? The classic issue going all the way back to the Greeks and how we can elect our own demagogue to bring about the fall of democracy. But what I mean by modern catalyst is just that, the internet, right? The internet is a way of, our our fathers had always envisioned a world filled with like future technology. We have all these videos and pictures, and even cartoons like the Jetsons, right? This idea that the future would be filled with technology that would make everything better and more accessible, and that people would naturally be inclined towards, bettering society. And the irony is the opposite has happened, right? Access to so much information has turned into access to no information, right? Too many choices has turned into no choice.
So true.
Right? And it's so weird how human nature has subverted the idea of what we thought would happen. And I think specifically what we're looking at right now is we're looking at the internet. I don't want to say the word echo chamber because while that's absolutely true, I think it's a little bit more complicated than just echo chambers. I think it's the internet has delegitimized or desensitized rather the populace to things that should concern them. And this is true on multiple levels, right? This is true when it comes to action, when it comes to news, when it comes to movies, when it comes to everything. Everything. We become so desensitized because the human brain was never intended to communicate with this many people and have this much information all the time. We weren't built for this. I fundamentally believe that we were not built for this. And it's interesting. It's interesting to see the effect that we have. And I think one of the biggest things in this particular conversation, when we look at what is happening with MAGA and Trump, is the internet has allowed ideas to flourish that have ironically been its own detriment. I want to point to people like Pat Buchanan, Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck is one of them for sure, Alex Jones, these people who have for years been spouting um, distrust in institutions. I believe it was Rush Limbaugh in particular who considered it the four corners of deceit, right? Government, media, science, and universities, or in his words, academics. And this has been the bedrock, right? Because of the internet, because of so much information per se out there, people don't know what to believe. We don't know how. There is no difference now to someone who's looking at news. There's no difference between a story that is false and a story that is true. And the reason why there's no difference to them, at least, is because both are text and images on a web page, right? And it begins to blur the lines when we have so much information, whether false or true, hitting our retinas, right? And I think we become desensitized to this and we don't see the real world implications of what it would mean if we just had a bunch of people who believed in something that was blatantly false. It's fun, it's a community, but we don't really understand the real world implications of what this means. And I think this is one of the things that the internet has done. Um, and it's one of the reasons that we are in the predicament that we're in. I don't think it's the sole reason because I think it would be disingenuous to say that technology is the catalyst or the only factor of why we are here. We know that's not true because other populaces before have found themselves where we are today. Hence, 1930s fascism, Italy and Germany. Without technology, they were able to also be radicalized, right? Because it's more about narrative and identity than it is necessarily about technology. But I think technology was the catalyst. It was the it was the adrenaline to the neck of society that just exponentially exploded this sentiment and these ideologies.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, sure, it's not the only reason at all, but I do think it was just one hell of a facilitating factor that just made it easier.
Yeah, totally.
And uh, you know, I guess it also I just wonder, like, I think in Germany, Megs, correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't the inhumanity, like the violence wasn't put on display for the populace immediately. You know what I mean? It was the rhetoric, the othering, the slow normalization. But
Absolutely.
it's like, but what we're seeing here is like, oh no, watch this for fun. And I don't know, I'm just trying to figure out like how all these things come together.
Well, I mean,
Uh,
I guess what I would say is I would argue the same has happened in a very different way, though. I would argue that the rise of right-wing media starting in the Ronald Reagan era in the 80s that led to, the fusion of conservatism, Christian nationalism with republicanism, uh, with things like the 700 Club and these huge televangelists really started emerging, pushing right-wing ideology, even on a very surface, innocent level kind of thing. I think that really was the start of it, and it bubbled under the surface through the 90s and early 2000s, and then culminated under. It really exploded under Obama. It was under Obama that we saw the highest numbers, other than Trump, the highest numbers of memberships in excuse me, in white nationalist groups. Right, we saw the highest numbers of gun purchasing records other than Trump under Obama, and it's because of this fear. It's because of these sentiments that have always existed. The same thing that Hitler did, right? You're 100% correct. It took a while for the public to truly accept, some kind of violence against the Jews kind of thing. And the reason being for that is because the rhetoric, it needed to take time to, not to mention, it also had to be that Hitler had to hijack certain existing sentiments within the population. We forget that half of the Holocaust wasn't in the camps. Half of the Holocaust was after Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler had pushed into Russia and he had armed the local populations of Estonia, Lithuania, and Romania, and he empowered them to find their Jewish neighbors and exterminate them with the
Yeah.
help of the German soldiers. And it's this idea of hijacking existing sentiments. And the same thing has happened with MAGA here in
Yep.
terms of hijacking existing sentiments of distrust in government, distrust in Fauci, and
And
the
racism.
and racism, 100%, absolutely, absolutely, in racism and misogyny, right?
Yeah.
It's hijacking these existing sentiments and using the conduit of the internet to crank that up to a 10 and to really start pushing your message, not just on a newspaper to the local population of 5,000 people in your city, but to 5 million people across a nation with just a short YouTube video. You know, and so it's when you put it all together, it's a very coordinated effort of messaging from the right, that's centered in, again, this ethno-nationalist preservation of the existing white power structure or ethno structure, basically, that has always dominated American politics and has been crumbling. It's been crumbling, and they see this as the detriment to the core of America, where, again, this is what we talked about in the other panel, where it's not, right. This is not a detriment to the core of America, but to the culture that they have continuously preserved. Whereas the true America are the shared set of values and principles that America was founded on, which are
Yeah.
enshrined in the Constitution and not in culture. But yeah, it's really, really scary. It's
Y-
not a good thing.
Yeah. I think the normalization of the inhumanity and the violence. I think what you're seeing now is them using social media to as a catalyst to that, even, right? Like you said, instead of reaching 5,000, you're reaching 5 million, and uh so I think that's part of it. But and that's what I try to explain to people, especially on the right, like these people's goals are not necessarily your goals, right? Like they're tapping into that to command support and for what they're doing. And you would think that given us the age of information, that an understanding of what happened in World War II would would prevent this. But we talk about World War II in a historical context just as like a series of events rather than a detailed explanation of how economic and societal factors combined with their political and psychological strategies to get to where 7 million or 9 million people could be eliminated, just exterminated. And then on
Absolutely.
the broader scale, 77 million people died in that war. I just don't, what the hell?
Absolutely.
So,
I think one of the biggest pitfalls that we as humans, but also we as Americans, fall into is that we tend to look at history as set, right? Like history is set in stone, and that, while it is true the past is set in stone, absolutely, but we see it as like there was no other alternative. This was bound to happen, and that's just not true, right? I think history, when you really get into the history of these events, you really tend to see how these things came together, how naturally they came together, right? That's the scary thing is when you look at it
yeah,
Like, a lot of people always say, how could Germany be so convinced by Hitler to eliminate 6 million Jews? Look at it. Let's talk about it, right? Let's talk about how
Right.
the natural narrative fed into the existing sentiments of the people, hijacked their empathy to villainize the very neighbors that they had for decades to see them as the threat, right? This is classic psychology. It's a classical human issue that's happening right now. It's just like I said again, it's modern catalyst that, through the conduit of the internet, like you said before, is just amplifying these voices. And one thing I will say about MAGA, it is much more subtle. It's much more subtle. And I don't want to sit here and compare and say that MAGA is Nazism because I do not want to make the comparison. I think the two
Mhm.
ideologies are extremely different in several ways.
For sure.
Uh,
Yeah, but it's the strategies that we're literally
Correct,
parallel.
correct. The pattern of behaviors are extremely similar and absolutely fascistic. I would argue it's a different form of fascism. It is American fascism, is what
We do
MAGA.
it the best.
We do it the best, right? I don't know. I think the Germans did it pretty well.
Yeah, I think
I
we
was just,
call it freedom.
oh, we're gonna see. I mean, it took him a couple years to get the concentration camps. It took us a couple months, so we're gonna find out.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, well, that's thanks to free trade, right?
yeah.
Right. Yeah, damn, I had one more thought
So,
there. I think I lost it.
well,
I
hey,
don't know.
look,
This is crazy.
we've covered a significant amount of constitutional territory across the amendments and constitutional structural principles. And I'd like to, as we wrap up, ask each of you for a brief closing thought on what concerned citizens should understand about these constitutional challenges. And we'll close with that.
Do you want to go first, Jesse, or you want me to go?
Yeah, I'll go first. Yeah, I mean, if I could give like a closing statement, it's to remember that what makes America America is its form of government. It is fundamentally different from every other nation or country that has existed in human history. That we take our definition and our pride in the separation of powers, in the freedoms that we enjoy, and not in the culture that has been forced upon us at times. And it really is the principles of the freedom of speech and separation of powers, three co-equal branches of government, checks, a system of checks and balances, and so on. Um, and there is one quote that I wanted to end off with, and it was actually I'm blanking now. Damn, what was it? Yeah, come back to me. I'm gonna remember this quote.
Okay. So yeah, I think in the same vein, it's like, okay, I don't know, I don't know why there's this certain sect of, and I'll say it, white people that are so tribalistic that what they're doing is somehow justified to them and the other things that they've done. But I agree, like this is America, like this is the United States of America. We have always been known by our freedoms. People want to come here because of our freedoms. And if you're going to find tribalism somewhere, find it in that. They can only do what we let them do at the end of the day. And that may be hard. It may be difficult, but our power is not lost yet. So if we're going to try something if we're going to do anything to avoid another 77 million people die for fascism, we have to get involved. People have got to get involved. People have got to be outraged. Find tribalism and be an American. Find tribalism and standing up for the civil rights of yourself and everybody else, because that's all we have at this point. Did you
Yeah,
remember your quote?
yeah, I did actually. So the quote was actually from Mike Pence, believe it or not, of all people.
Hey,
Um, after Joe Biden had taken office, Trump took to social media to continuously attack Pence, saying that he didn't have the guts to do what he needed to do to stand up for America. A few months later, Pence would be speaking at a conference. I forgot exactly what the event was, but he was quoted saying, um, "Had ladies and gentlemen, if we lose faith in our Constitution, we don't just lose our Constitution, we lose our country." And I could not agree more. And as much as I ideologically disagree with Pence on probably almost every single issue, I do have to give him credit that he at least had the fortitude to stand with the principles of the Constitution on January 6th. Um, and I think what he said rings true, right? It's this idea that again, what makes the Constitution, what makes America America, is the idea that lives in the collective minds of society. And I think Obama said this multiple times. What makes America live on is that we believe it does. What makes democracy works is that we make it work. Obama is quoted saying this several times throughout his presidency and thereafter. And this is so true. The only reason why the document of the Constitution lives on is because we make it live on. Um, and the only way we can make it live on is not rooting it in culture, but rooting it in the principles and the laws and the spirit of the Constitution itself. And I think it's what makes it so vital to our country.
I
Couldn't
fully
agree more.
agree. I fully agree, and I think again, just a great conversation. Love that we were able to kind of express more of our individual thoughts as it relates to the administration's attack on the United States Constitution. And for our viewers out there, if you're just tuning in, do understand that this is one of many roundtable discussions coming to you soon. Please feel free to visit www.moneyoutofpolitics.org at your convenience, where you can find out more information about our March for Integrity, where we will be bringing 2 million Americans to Capitol Hill to stand at the door of Congress and demand the change that our country deserves and that we so desperately need. Please stay up to date with everything that the movement is doing, as well as watching our coalition grow. If you'd like to get involved at the grassroots level, please join our Discord. The link is available in my bio on TikTok at Quiet Mayhem, on YouTube at Quiet.Mayhem. And thanks for being here with us tonight. Be sure to check back, like, follow, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis on what's going on in our government. Bye for now. Power to the people.